It was the perfect storm, literally. And I don't use that phrase lightly. February 18th, 1979. If you looked out your window anywhere from Georgia to Massachusetts, the world was white, silent, dead. The entire Eastern Seaboard was locked down under one of the most brutal blizzards of the decade. Airports were closed. Highways were parking lots buried under 2 feet of drift. You couldn't go to church. You couldn't go to the store. You certainly couldn't go to work. Millions of Americans were trapped in their living rooms, shivering, bored out of their minds, staring at the only thing that was still working, the television. And on CBS, something was happening that shouldn't have been happening. The screen wasn't showing gray slush or snowplows. It was showing sunshine. It was showing palm trees. It was showing 41 loud, colorful, violent machines tearing around a high-banked oval at 200 miles an hour. This is legacy motoring. And I spend way too much time thinking about the specific moments when automotive history stopped being about cars and started being about culture. If you're someone who loves the stories behind the horsepower, the fights, the politics, and the engineering that changed the world, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, you might be thinking, okay, it's just a race. People watch races all the time. But here's the thing. In 1979, people didn't watch stock car racing. Not like this. Before that Sunday in February, NASCAR was a ghost to the rest of the country. It was a regional curiosity. A southern thing. If you lived in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, stock car racing was something that happened in dusty fields in Alabama, watched by people who drank moonshine and drove pickup trucks. The big 3 networks, ABC, CBS, they treated it like a sideshow. They'd show maybe 15 minutes of highlights a week later on Wide World of Sports, sandwiched between cliff diving and barrel jumping. It wasn't a sport. It was a demolition derby with a southern accent. But CBS had an idea. A risky, expensive, borderline insane idea. They decided to broadcast the Daytona 500 live. Flag to flag, start to finish. No tape delay, no editing out the boring parts, just 3.5 hours of cars driving in circles. The executives were sweating bullets. They had paid a small fortune for the rights, and they were terrified that nobody north of the Mason-Dixon line would tune in. They thought the audience would get bored after 10 laps. They thought the advertisers would revolt. They were predicting a disaster. Here's what most people don't realize. The blizzard saved them. That snowstorm wasn't just weather. It was the most effective marketing campaign in the history of television. It held an entire nation hostage. People who wouldn't know a carburetor from a coffee pot were suddenly stuck on the couch with nothing else to watch. So they watched the race, and what they saw wasn't just cars driving in circles. They saw a gladiator match. To understand why this race mattered, we have to look at the machines themselves, because this is where it gets really interesting. The 1979 grid was a weird mix of old-school engineering and new-school aerodynamics. We were deep in the malaise era of American automotive history. Street cars in 1979 were, well, they were terrible. Choked by emissions regulations, heavy, slow, and ugly. A 1979 Mustang made about as much horsepower as a modern lawnmower. But the cars sitting on the grid at Daytona, they were monsters. These were the Gen 2 cars. A 115-inch wheelbase, a full steel chassis. And under the hood, they were running 358 cubic inch V8s that were pushing 600 horsepower. Think about that for a second. 600 horsepower on bias ply tires with no power steering and no downforce. Driving one of these things was like trying to wrestle a bear in a phone booth while plummeting down an elevator shaft. It was physical. It was violent. The drivers didn't just steer, they fought the wheel for 500 miles. Their hands would bleed. Their feet would blister from the heat of the transmission tunnel. Now, let's talk about the specific metal on the track, because there's a detail here that usually gets lost in the history books. The car to beat that year wasn't a Chevy or a Ford. It was an Oldsmobile. Specifically, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme Aeroback. If you remember the street version of this car, it was kind of hideous. It had this weird sloping rear roofline that looked like someone had chopped the trunk off with a hacksaw. The public hated it. Sales were awful. But on the high banks of Daytona, that ugly sloping roof was aerodynamic gold. The air clung to it like glue. It was cleaner, slipperier, and faster than anything else out there. Cale Yarborough was driving one. Donnie Allison was driving one. Even the king, Richard Petty, who had been a die-hard Mopar and Chevy man, took one look at the wind tunnel data and swallowed his pride. He showed up to Daytona in an Oldsmobile. That's how good that ugly car was. It forced the king to switch brands. Speaking of the king, Richard Petty in 1979 was at a crossroads. He was 41 years old. He hadn't won a race in over a year. He was recovering from stomach surgery that had removed 40% of his stomach. He looked gaunt, tired, and honestly a little washed up. The young guns were circling. Guys like Darrell Waltrip, who ran his mouth as fast as he ran his car, and then you had the heavy hitters. Cale Yarborough. Let me tell you about Cale Yarborough. Imagine a bulldog that learned how to drive a race car. That was Cale. He was short, stocky, and built like a fire hydrant. He was a 3-time consecutive champion coming into 1979. He was the dominant force in the sport. He didn't just want to beat you, he wanted to embarrass you. He drove the number 11 Busch Beer Oldsmobile for Junior Johnson, the legendary moonshiner turned team owner. It was the perfect pairing. A driver who wouldn't lift and an owner who didn't care how much the car cost as long as it won. Then you had the Alabama gang, the Allison brothers, Bobby and Donnie. Donnie Allison was in the number 1 Hawaiian Tropic Oldsmobile. It was probably the most beautiful car on the grid, maroon and gold, looking fast even when it was parked. Donnie was complicated. He was incredibly talented, maybe more naturally gifted than his brother Bobby, but he had a chip on his shoulder the size of Talladega. He felt like he never got the credit he deserved. He felt like the sport was always looking at Petty or Yarborough or his brother. He wanted this win. He needed this win. So the stage is set. You have the blizzard locking the audience in. You have CBS taking a massive financial gamble. You have the aging king trying to prove he's not dead yet. You have the bulldog champion Cale Yarborough trying to stomp on everyone's throat. And you have the hungry, angry Donnie Allison sitting on the pole in the fastest car in the world. The green flag drops and immediately the millions of people watching at home realize something. The sound. CBS had placed microphones all around the track. For the first time, people heard the raw, unadulterated roar of 41 unrestricted V8 engines screaming at 7,000 RPM. It didn't sound like a sport. It sounded like a war. And the racing? It was frantic. See, Daytona is a restrictor plate track today, which means they choke the engines down to keep the speed safe. But in 1979, there were no plates. These engines were breathing free. They were hitting 195, almost 200 miles an hour on the backstretch. And because the cars were so aerodynamically unstable, they were sliding around. They weren't glued to the track like modern cars. You could see the drivers sawing at the wheel, correcting slides at 190 miles an hour, inches away from each other. For the first half of the race, it was a blur of lead changes. Buddy Baker was fast. Darrell Waltrip was fast. A.J. Foyt, the IndyCar legend who came down to drive a stock car just for the hell of it, he was fast. But as the laps ticked down, as the sun started to dip lower over the Florida palm trees, it became clear that this was a 2-horse race. It was Cale Yarborough versus Donnie Allison, the Bulldog versus the Alabama gang. They were in a league of their own. Their Oldsmobiles were hooked up. They could draft together and pull away from the pack whenever they wanted. It looked like a choreographed dance. They would swap the lead back and forth, testing each other. You lead for a while, save some gas, then I'll lead. It was professional. It was respectful. But everyone watching, the announcers, the fans in the stands, the millions freezing in their living rooms, knew that the respect was going to evaporate the moment the white flag waved. Ken Squire, the announcer for CBS, was doing a masterclass in storytelling. He wasn't just calling out car numbers. He was building a narrative. He called them gladiators. He talked about the danger. He made sure the audience knew that a single mistake meant metal tearing and bones breaking. He was priming the pump for what was about to happen. And then, disaster struck for the first time. Not a crash, a spin. On lap 31, Donnie's brother Bobby Allison got tagged and spun through the infield grass. He didn't hit anything, but he fell a lap down. This is important. Keep this in your mind. Bobby Allison, one of the toughest men to ever sit in a race car, was now out of contention for the win. He was angry. He was lurking, and he had nothing to do but drive around and wait for the race to end. Or so he thought. By the time we got to the final 20 laps, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Cale and Donnie were nose to tail, running away from the field. They had left everyone else in the dust. Richard Petty was running third, but he was half a lap behind. In racing terms, he was in a different zip code. He was just hoping to finish third and go home. There was no way he could catch the leaders. Not unless something crazy happened. But this is Daytona, and crazy is built into the asphalt. And then, with just a handful of laps to go, the physics of high-speed stock car racing took over. Now, if you're not a racing fan, let me explain something called the draft. When a car punches a hole in the air at 200 miles per hour, it leaves a vacuum behind it, a low-pressure zone. If you're the car behind and you tuck your nose right under the leader's bumper, you get sucked into that vacuum. You don't have to work as hard. Your engine runs cooler. You save gas. But most importantly, you have more horsepower available because you aren't fighting the wind. You're literally being pulled along by the car in front of you. This creates a problem for the leader. The leader is doing all the work. They are smashing into a wall of air every single second. The guy behind is coasting. And eventually, the guy behind is going to use that extra momentum to slingshot past you. It's simple physics. Donnie Allison knew this. Cale Yarborough knew this. They were locked together like two freight trains on a downhill track. Donnie was leading. Cale was stalking him. Cale was waiting. He was patient. He knew he had the faster car in the draft. All he needed was one tiny mistake, just a flicker, and he got it. With less than 2 laps to go, something happened under the hood of Donnie Allison's Oldsmobile. A stutter, a hiccup. Maybe a piece of debris in the carburetor jet. Maybe a fuel pickup issue. We still argue about it today. But for a split second, the number 1 car hesitated. The engine note faltered. At 70 miles per hour on the highway, you wouldn't even notice it. At 195 miles per hour on the Daytona banking, it was like hitting a brick wall. Cale pounced. He didn't even blink. He jerked the wheel to the left, diving low to the inside. He had the momentum. He had the speed. He was going to pass Donnie before they even hit turn 3. It was over. The race was his. But Donnie Allison wasn't about to let the Daytona 500 slip away because of a carburetor hiccup. He saw Cale coming. He saw the Never 11 car's nose fill his mirror. And he did what any racer would do. He defended his line. He moved left. He chopped down to blot the pass. Now, here is where physics meets ego. When 2 objects occupy the same space at 200 miles an hour, physics usually wins. Cale's right side tires dropped onto the flat apron, the grass, and dirt at the very bottom of the track. He lost traction. The car wiggled. He drifted up the track. Donnie was coming down. They touched. It wasn't a violent smash. It was a kiss. Metal on metal. But at those speeds, a kiss is deadly. The car's unsettled. They banged doors again. And then the rear of Cale's car hooked the rear of Donnie's car. It was instant. Both machines snapped sideways. They were no longer race cars. They were 3,500-pound uncontrolled missiles. They slammed into the outside retaining wall. Concrete dust exploded into the air. Sparks showered the asphalt like fireworks. Then they spun back down across the track, sliding through the infield grass, tearing up sodden dirt, finally coming to a rest at the bottom of turn 3. The crowd went absolutely silent. Then they exploded, because look at the track. The leaders were gone. The race wasn't over. Who was left? Remember Richard Petty, the washed-up king? The guy running half a lap down in 3rd place? He came around turn 2 and saw a cloud of smoke. He saw the 2 fastest cars in the world sitting in a heap of steaming metal in the grass. He couldn't believe his eyes. He lifted off the gas just to be safe, picked his way through the debris, and suddenly, impossibly, he was in the lead. But it wasn't over for him either. Darrell Waltrip and A.J. Foyt were right behind him, racing for 2nd place. Suddenly, they were racing for the win. AJJ. Foyt, the open-wheel legend, backed off. He saw the wreck and did the smart thing. Darrell Waltrip, he hammered down. He thought he could catch Petty. For the final lap, it was a drag race. The King in his Oldsmobile versus Jaws Waltrip in his Mercury. Petty crossed the line first by a car length. He had done it. He had won his 6th Daytona 500. It was a miracle. A gift from the racing gods. The crowd was going nuts. The announcers were screaming, "Petty wins it! Petty wins it! Petty wins it!" It should have been the headline of every newspaper in America. The King returns. Petty conquest. But nobody was looking at Richard Petty. The cameras had cut away. They weren't focused on victory lane. They weren't focused on the trophy. They were focused on a patch of muddy grass in the infield of turn 3, because down there, the race was over. But the fight had just begun. Cale Yarborough had climbed out of his wrecked car. He was hot. He was sweaty. He had just lost the biggest race of his life because, in his mind, Donnie Allison had run him off the road. He marched over to Donnie's car. Donnie was climbing out, dazed, furious. He felt Cale had wrecked him intentionally. They started shouting. You couldn't hear the words over the roar of the engines cooling down, but you could read the body language, finger pointing, chest bumping. It was tense, but it was just shouting. Two angry guys venting steam. It happens in racing every weekend. He usually ends with a handshake or a screw you, and everyone goes home. Then a third car pulled up. It was Bobby Allison. Remember him? Donnie's brother who had been lapped earlier? He saw the wreck. He saw his little brother standing there arguing with Cale. He stopped his car illegal, by the way. You aren't supposed to stop on the track, and got out. Now, imagine the scene. You have millions of people watching live TV, families, grandmothers, little kids. They just wanted to see who won the race. Instead, they see 3 grown men in fire suits standing in a field. Bobby walks up. Cale sees him. And Cale, realizing he is now outnumbered 2-1 by the toughest brothers in Alabama, decides that diplomacy is over. He swings his helmet. He doesn't throw a punch. He swings his helmet at Bobby Allison's face. And that is the moment the world changed. Bobby didn't flinch. He just started swinging. Donnie jumped in. Cale was fighting for his life against 2 guys. They were rolling around in the mud, punching, kicking, grabbing each other's helmets. A police officer tried to intervene and got shoved away. It was chaos. It was ugly. It was raw, unscripted, genuine human anger broadcast into 15 million living rooms. Ken Squire, the announcer, didn't apologize. He didn't cut to commercial. He famously shouted, "And there's a fight." Between Cale Yarborough and Donnie Allison, the temper's overflowing. They are angry. They know they have lost. And what a bitter defeat. He narrated the fistfight with the same gravitas he used for the race. He validated it. He told the audience, don't look away. This is part of the sport. This is passion. Most people don't realize how dangerous this moment was for NASCAR. The executives in the high towers in New York could have pulled the plug. They could have said, this is exactly what we feared. These are hillbillies behaving like animals. We are never broadcasting this again. It could have been the end of national coverage. It could have sent the sport back to the dark ages. But here's the thing about human psychology. We say we want clean sportsmanship. We say we want fair play. But deep down, we want drama. We want conflict. We want to see people care about something so much that they are willing to bleed for it. The phones at CBS lit up, not with complaints, with questions. Who won the fight? Is Cale okay? When is the next race? The ratings for the last 15 minutes of that broadcast were astronomical. It rivaled the Super Bowl. People who had never seen a stock car in their life were suddenly arguing at the water cooler on Monday morning about whether Cale or Donnie was at fault. The blizzard had trapped them inside. The race had kept them entertained. But the fight hooked them. It turned casual viewers into addicts. It created a narrative that wasn't about cars. It was about tribes. You were either a Chevy guy or a Ford guy, a Yarborough fan or an Allison fan. You picked a side, and once you pick a side, and you have to watch the next race to see if your guy gets revenge. NASCAR had accidentally stumbled upon the formula that would make it a multi-billion-dollar empire, high-speed danger plus high-stakes soap opera. But let's pause for a second, because while everyone remembers the fight, almost everyone forgets the technological aftermath. This race didn't just change the culture, it changed the cars. And this is where the engineering nerds need to pay attention. He might be thinking, okay, They had a fight, big deal. Hockey players fight every night. But here's the thing. In hockey, fighting is part of the game. It's regulated. In 1979 motorsport, fighting on live national television was unprecedented. It was raw, and it forced NASCAR to make a choice. They could either fine everyone, suspend the Allisons in Yarborough, and apologize profusely to the viewing public for the unsportsmanlike conduct, or they could lean into it. They leaned into it hard. The very next week, at Rockingham, North Carolina, the grandstands were sold out. People who had never been to a racetrack in their lives were lining up at the gates at 6:00 a.m. They weren't there to see engineering. They were there to see if Cale and Donnie would kill each other. The footage of the fight was replayed on every news station in the country. It was on the front page of the New York Times sports section. For the first time ever, the redneck sport was water cooler talk on Wall Street. And this brings us to a character in the story that most people completely miss. While Cale and Donnie were brawling in the mud, and while Richard Petty was celebrating in Victory Lane, there was a 27-year-old rookie driving a blue and yellow Buick who had quietly finished 8th. He was aggressive, he was fearless, and he was watching everything. His name was Dale Earnhardt. This is where it gets really interesting. The 1979 Daytona 500 wasn't just the end of the Regnal era. It was the birth of the Intimidator era. Dale Earnhardt saw that race. He saw that the fans didn't boo the fight. They cheered for it. He saw that Richard Petty won by being smart, but Cale Yarborough got famous by being violent. Earnhardt synthesized those two lessons. He realized that to be a legend in this new televised NASCAR, you didn't just have to drive fast. You had to be a character. You had to be the villain. The 1979 season is often remembered for the fight, but it was actually Earnhardt's rookie year. He would go on to win Rookie of the Year that season, and the very next year, in 1980, he would win the championship. That is insane. Imagine a rookie quarterback winning the Super Bowl his second year in the league. Earnhardt represented the new breed of driver that the 1979 broadcast created: marketable, dangerous, and willing to wreck you to win. Now, let's talk about the money. Because money ruins everything, right? Well, in this case, money accelerated everything. Before 1979, NASCAR sponsors were mostly automotive companies, oil filters, spark plugs, tire brands, maybe a beer company here and there. It was industry money. But after the 1979 broadcast proved that 15 million people would watch a race, the consumer money arrived. Suddenly, you had laundry detergent brands, fast food chains, soft drinks. The side of a NASCAR stock car became the most valuable billboard in American sports. Why? Because the camera lingered on it for 4 hours. In football, the camera is on the players, not the logos. In racing, the car is the logo. This influx of cash changed the engineering. Teams could afford wind tunnels now. They could afford engine dynos that cost more than a house. They could hire engineers from aerospace companies. The cars, which had been modified street machines in 1979, started to morph into purebred prototypes. The sheet metal still looked like a Buick or a Ford, but underneath, it was space-age technology disguised as a taxicab. By the mid-1980s, speeds were climbing out of control. In 1979, pole position at Daytona was 196 miles per hour. By 1985, Bill Elliott would be hitting 210. The cars were becoming airplanes. They were generating lift. If a car spun sideways at 200 miles an hour, the air would catch underneath it and launch it into the catch fence. And this takes us back to the dark side of that 1979 race. The crash between Cale and Donnie was violent, yes, but they walked away. The cars crumbled, absorbed the energy, and stayed on the ground. It gave everyone a false sense of security. It made people think, hey, these cars are tanks. You can crash at 190 and be fine. Most people don't realize that this complacency was deadly. The safety standards in 1979 were primitive. Drivers wore open-face helmets. They sat in seats made of fiberglass that could crack on impact. Their head and neck support was basically a strap and a prayer. There were no soft walls, SAFER barriers to absorb the impact. If you hit the wall, you hit concrete. The sport spent the next 20 years chasing speed. fueled by the popularity explosion that started in that 1979 blizzard. But they didn't chase safety with the same intensity. It would take the death of the very man who debuted in that 1979 race, Dale Earnhardt, 22 years later, on the very same track in the very same race, to finally force NASCAR to revolutionize safety. But in the immediate aftermath of '79, nobody was thinking about death. They were thinking about expansion. CBS, seeing the goldmine they had struck, signed a long-term contract. ESPN launched later that year and needed content to fill their 24-hour cycle. Guess what they chose? Racing. It was cheap to produce, exciting to watch, and they could replay it endlessly. The flag-to-flag coverage became the standard. They started putting cameras inside the cars. They started putting microphones in the engine bays. They realized that the visceral sound of the sport was just as important as the visuals. Look, you have to understand the cultural landscape of America in 1979. We were coming out of Vietnam. We were in the middle of a gas crisis. Inflation was sky high. The national mood was depressed. Americans felt like they were losing their power, losing their standing in the world. And then here comes a sport that is unapologetically loud, unapologetically American, consuming massive amounts of gasoline just for the thrill of it. It was a middle finger to the malaise of the era. It was escapism, pure and simple. And the drivers, they became folk heroes. Cale Yarborough didn't lose fans after the fight, he gained them. He became the symbol of the working man who wouldn't take crap from anyone. The Allisons became the tragic heroes, the family dynasty fighting against the odds. And Richard Petty, Richard Petty became immortality. That win in '79 was his swan song in many ways. He would win one more Daytona 500 later, but '79 was the last time he truly dominated on speed and guile alone. But there is one more layer to the story that usually gets left out of the documentaries, and it's about the blizzard itself. Meteorologists call it the President's Day storm of 1979. It dumped 20 inches of snow on Washington, D.C. It killed over 100 people. It was a genuine natural disaster. And yet, if you ask a car enthusiast about that date, they don't talk about the snow. They talk about the fight. It's a strange quirk of history that a deadly storm is now primarily remembered as the reason why a bunch of guys in Alabama got famous. It makes you wonder about destiny. If that low-pressure system had tracked 50 miles further east, out to sea, no snow, no captive audience, no massive ratings, the fight still happens, sure, but maybe only 2 million people see it instead of 15 million. Maybe CBS decides the ratings aren't worth the cost. Maybe NASCAR stays a regional sport for another decade. Maybe Dale Earnhardt doesn't see the potential for stardom and stays a mechanic. The butterfly effect is real. And in this case, the butterfly was a snowflake. Now, let's fast forward a bit, because the legacy of 1979 isn't just about what happened then. It's about what happened next. The 1980s were the golden era for a reason. The cars got faster, the drivers got richer, and the rivalries got deeper. The manufacturer wars returned. Ford versus Chevy became a legitimate battleground. Dealerships would literally sell more Monte Carlos on Monday if a Monte Carlo won on Sunday, if a Monte Carlo won on Sunday. That saying, win on Sunday, sell on Monday, was never more true than in the post-1979 world. But as the sport grew, it also began to change. It began to sanitize itself. The rough edges that made 1979 so compelling, the fistfights, the raw anger, the non-politically correct interviews, started to disappear as the corporate money piled up. When you have $1 million sponsorship from a family-friendly detergent company, you can't punch someone in the face on national TV anymore. Or can you? Here's the thing. NASCAR spent the next 40 years trying to answer that question. They wanted the money from Tide and Kellogg's, but they also wanted the raw, unpolished anger that made 15 million people tune in during a blizzard. It became a balancing act. They would fine drivers for fighting, but then they would use the footage of the fight in every single commercial for the next race. They were selling the very thing they were technically prohibiting. It was brilliant, it was cynical, and it worked. But let's get back to the men in the mud, because their stories didn't end when the cameras turned off. In fact, for one of them, the story was just getting started. Cale Yarborough. Remember him, the guy who started swinging his helmet? You might think that losing the Daytona 500 in such a humiliating way would break a man. You might think he'd slink away, embarrassed. Nope. Cale Yarborough was made of different stuff. He was a 3-time consecutive champion coming into that race. 1976, 1976, 1977, 1976, 1976. Losing that race didn't break him, it just made him meaner. He went on to win 4 races that season. He finished 4th in the championship. And get this, in 1983 and 1984, he would come back to Daytona and win the 500 back-to-back. He conquered the track that had embarrassed him. He proved that the fight wasn't the end of his legacy. It was just a chaotic chapter in a book about dominance. And then there's Donnie Allison, the man who blocked the pass, the man who arguably started the wreck. His story is quieter and sadder. That 1979 race was his best chance. He had the pole, he had the car, he had the lead with half a lap to go. He never got that close again. In May of 1981, at the World 600 in Charlotte, a crash left him with severe injuries that effectively ended his competitive career in the Cup Series. He raced a few more times, but the magic was gone. The fight in the grass was the climax of his career, not the beginning. It's a harsh reality of motorsport. Sometimes you only get one shot at immortality. And if you miss it, or someone wrecks you, that's it. But the most tragic arc belongs to the third man in the fight, Bobby Allison. Bobby was already a legend in 7-9, but his post-1979 career is like a Greek tragedy written in gasoline and rubber. He finally won his Daytona 500 in 1982. Then he won the championship in 1983. And then, in 1988, he won the Daytona 500 again. But that 1988 race is famous for a different reason. He finished 1-2 with his son, Davey Allison. It was a beautiful moment. Father and son battling for the win, celebrating together in victory lane. It looked like the Allison dynasty was set for another 20 years. But destiny is cruel. Just a few months later at Pocono, Bobby was involved in a horrific first-lap crash. A tire failed. He spun driver's side into the wall and was T-boned by another car. He suffered massive head injuries. He survived, but he never raced again. His career was over in an instant. And then, the darkness really set in. Within a span of 11 months in the early 90s, Bobby lost both of his sons. Clifford died in a practice crash at Michigan. Davey died in a helicopter crash at Talladega. When you look back at that footage of the 3 of them fighting in the grass in 1979, laughing about it later, it feels different now. It feels heavy. You're watching men at the peak of their physical powers, completely unaware of the tragedies waiting for them down the road. It adds a layer of poignancy to the violence. They were fighting over a trophy, not knowing that life was going to take so much more from them than a race win. Now, let's pivot back to the cars, because 1979 marked the end of an era in a very literal, mechanical sense. Look, if you're a gearhead, you know that 1979 was the last stand of the big cars. The 115-inch wheelbase behemoths, these were the Chevelle Lagunas, the Monte Carlos, the old Cutlasses that looked like they stretched across 2 zip codes. They were heavy, stable, and absorbed crashes well. But Detroit was changing. The oil crisis had killed the muscle car. The manufacturers were downsizing. They were moving to smaller, lighter, more fuel-efficient platforms for the street. NASCAR had to follow suit. In 1981, just 2 years after the fight, NASCAR mandated a switch to a 110-inch wheelbase. The cars got smaller. The Gen 3 era began, and this transition was messy. The new cars were twitchier. They were harder to drive. The aerodynamics were all wrong at first. Teams struggled to make them stable at 200 miles per hour. But here's what most people don't realize. That 1979 race forced the teams to get smarter, faster. Because the money was pouring in, the teams could afford to hire aerodynamicists to solve the instability of the new small cars. They started wind tunnel testing in earnest. They learned about cowl pressure, rear downforce, and side force. The 1979 fight created the revenue that paid for the science that fixed the cars of the 1980s. It's a direct line. Without the blizzard, without the fight, without the ratings, the teams would have stayed in the dark ages of eyeball engineering for another decade. Instead, they became high-tech organizations. By 1985, Bill Elliott's Ford Thunderbird Gen 3 car was so aerodynamically superior that he made up 2 entire laps under green at Talladega. He was driving a spaceship compared to the brick that Cale Yarborough wrestled in 1979. The sport had evolved from a fistfight in the mud to a battle of drag coefficients and wind tunnel data. And the pit crews? They changed too. In 1979, the guys changing tires were often just mechanics who grabbed a wrench on Sunday. They were big guys, strong guys, but they weren't athletes. The pit stops took 20-25 seconds. It was leisurely by modern standards, but the Wood brothers, the team that invented the modern pit stop, had shown that seconds mattered, and with the influx of TV money, other teams started to copy them. They started hiring college athletes, linebackers, wrestling champions, guys who didn't know how to rebuild an engine but could carry a 60-pound tire and sprint around a car in 4 seconds flat. The pit crew coach became a job title. They started training in gyms. They practiced stops thousands of times a week. The 1979 broadcast showed the world that a race could be lost in the pits. Remember, Donnie Allison lost the lead partly because his crew was a fraction slower than Cale's on the last stop sequence. So, the legacy of 1979 isn't just about the drivers. It's about the professionalization of every single person wearing a uniform. The guy holding the jack became a specialist. The guy fueling the car became a specialist. The sport grew up, but as it grew up, did it lose its soul? That's the question every longtime fan asks. When you watch a modern race, the drivers are polished. They have media training. They know exactly what to say to the sponsors. I want to thank my team. The car was great. The guys at the shop did a good job. It's clean. It's professional. And frankly, it's a little boring. You don't see helmets being swung anymore. If a driver gets out of his car and walks toward another driver, the officials are there in 10 seconds to separate them. The boys have at it era is gone, replaced by the boys think about the sponsors era. But every now and then, the mask slips. Every now and then, the pressure gets too high, the stakes get too big, and 2 drivers forget the cameras. They forget the fines. They forget the PR reps, and they just react. And when that happens, when a driver shoves another driver on pit road, or throws a water bottle, or wrecks someone in the final turn, the internet explodes. The ratings jump. The clips go viral. Why? Because deep down, we are still the same people who were trapped in our houses by a blizzard in 1979. We still crave that raw, unscripted human emotion. We want to see the cracks in the armor. We want to know that it matters to them as much as it matters to us. That is the enduring power of February 18th, 1979. It proved that underneath the millions of dollars of technology, underneath the carbon fiber and the telemetry and the wind tunnels, racing is still just a bunch of guys trying to get to a line on the ground before the other guy. And if they can't get there first, they might just decide to fight you for it. And speaking of getting there first, we need to talk about the man who actually did. Because amidst all the talk of fistfights and blizzards, Richard Petty has become the strangest footnote in sports history. Here is the irony: the King won the most important race in NASCAR history, and nobody remembers how he drove. They only remember that he didn't crash. Petty's 6th Daytona 500 victory was a masterpiece of patience. He knew his Oldsmobile wasn't fast enough to beat the leaders on raw speed. He knew that if he tried to race them straight up, he'd lose. So he waited. He let them use up their equipment. He let them use up their patience. And when they finally took each other out, he was there to pick up the pieces. It's the ultimate lesson in motorsport. To finish first, you must first finish. But for Petty, the 1979 Daytona 500 was bittersweet. He stood in victory lane, holding the trophy, the cameras flashing, the confetti falling, and half the reporters were running toward the infield care center to get a quote from Cale Yarborough. The King had reclaimed his throne, but the court jester had stolen the show. It was a changing of the guard, even if the scoreboard didn't show it. The era of the gentleman driver was ending. The era of the media star was beginning. Petty would win one more Daytona 500 in 1981, his 7th and final, but he would never again be the singular face of the sport in the way he was before 1979. The spotlight had fractured. It was now shared by the brawlers, the aggressors, the men who understood that bad publicity beats no publicity. And this brings us to the final, most lasting legacy of that snowy afternoon in February: the speed. You see, the 1979 Daytona 500 was one of the last pure races on a super speedway. The cars were unrestricted. The engines could gulp as much air and fuel as they wanted. They were hitting speeds that were frankly terrifying for the technology of the time. In the years that followed, as the money poured in and the engineering advanced, the speeds got even higher. By 1987, Bill Elliott set a qualifying record at Talladega of 2,122.89 miles per hour. The cars were flying, literally, and it was becoming clear that the physics had outpaced the safety. NASCAR looked back at 1979. They looked at how close Cale and Donnie came to disaster, and they made a decision that controversial to this day. They introduced the restrictor plate, a small, square piece of aluminum with 4 holes drilled in it. It sits between the carburetor and the intake manifold, choking the engine's air supply. It cut horsepower from 700 plus down to about 450. This decision to artificially slow the cars down created pack racing. Because no one had the power to pull away, everyone had to run in a giant 200 miles per hour traffic jam. It was safer, maybe, but it also guaranteed more crashes. The big one, where 10 or 15 cars pile up because one guy sneeze, became a regular feature of Daytona. And where did this philosophy come from? It traces back to the excitement of 1979. The executives saw that fans loved close racing. They loved the slingshot pass. They loved the danger. Restrictor plate racing manufactured that excitement. It forced the cars to stay together, creating the illusion of a close race even when one car was dominant. It was the entertainment side of the business finally overtaking the sports side. So when you watch the Daytona 500 today and you see 30 cars running 3 wide, bumper to bumper, terrifyingly close to one another, you are watching the ghost of 1979. You are watching a sport that decided, consciously or not, to prioritize the show over the purity of speed. And you know what? They were right, because without that show, without that drama, NASCAR would have remained a regional curiosity. It would be like dirt track racing, beloved by locals, unknown to the world. The blizzard of 1979 gave the sport a lottery ticket. The fight in the infield cashed it, and the decades of growth that followed were just the interest compounding. We often look for complex reasons why things happen in history. We look for economic trends, or political shifts, or technological breakthroughs. But sometimes, history hinges on a single chaotic afternoon where everything goes wrong in exactly the right way. If it hadn't snowed, if Donnie's engine hadn't stuttered, if Cale hadn't lost his temper, if Pobby hadn't stopped his car, we wouldn't be talking about this. There would be no legacy motoring channel. There would be no billion-dollar TV contracts. There would be no Dale Earnhardt legend. The 1979 Daytona 500 proves that in racing, just like in life, you can plan all you want. You can build the perfect car. You can qualify on the pole. You can lead every lap. But in the end, you are at the mercy of the elements, the other guy, and the sheer dumb luck of the universe. And isn't that why we watch? We watch because for 3 hours on a Sunday, anything is possible. A king can be ignored. A fistfight can change the world, and a snowstorm can turn a bunch of good old boys into global superstars. So the next time you see a highlight reel of Cale Yarborough swinging that helmet, don't just laugh at the retro footage. Respect it. Because that swing didn't just hit Bobby Allison. It hit the accelerator on an entire sport. It broke the sound barrier of American culture. It was the fight heard round the world. And the echoes? We're still hearing them today. Thanks for watching Legacy Motoring. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the most important day in racing history, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories about the machines, the men, and the madness coming your way. I'll see you in the next one.